never thought I'd see the day my son would confront me about my deepest secrets. Secrets I wasn't even ready to admit to myself. But there he was, standing in my doorway, his words piercing through the walls I had carefully built. "Mom, why are you so unhappy?" In that moment, I realized nothing would ever be the same. Sarah had always believed her life was simple, even predictable. She was a devoted mother and a wife to Mark, a man she had married with hopes of a fulfilling future. For years, they shared what seemed like a stable, if not passionate, relationship. Their home was filled with warmth, laughter, and the comforting routines of family life. Ethan, her teenage son, was her pride and joy. Quiet yet thoughtful, he was the kind of boy who could light up a room with his genuine smile. He'd always been Sarah's anchor, the one constant in her world that seemed to shift as time moved on. She prided herself on being an attentive mother, always present for him, until recently. But cracks had begun to show in the foundation of her life. Sarah's marriage to Mark, though functional, had lost its spark long ago. She couldn't pinpoint when it started, but the distance between them grew, inch by inch, until it became a chasm. She told herself it was normal for relationships to settle into monotony, but the emptiness she felt each night was hard to ignore. Mark's focus on his demanding job left little time for intimacy, and Sarah began to feel more like a shadow in her own home. Despite her growing unhappiness, she kept up appearances for Ethan. She didn't want her struggles to affect him, but as the days passed, her facade started to slip. Ethan, perceptive as ever, began noticing the change. The light-hearted conversations they once shared became strained, and his once carefree demeanor seemed overshadowed by concern. That night, when Ethan stood at her door, hesitant but determined, Sarah felt her carefully controlled world tilt. His words, though spoken with love, cut through her like a blade. "Mom, why do you seem so far away these days? What's wrong?" In that moment, Sarah realized the walls she had built around her emotions weren't just crumbling. They had already fallen. She was left exposed, not only to Ethan, but to herself. The ache of guilt mixed with the longing for something she couldn't name, leaving her torn between the life she had built and the one she silently yearned for. In the days that followed Ethan's late-night confession, Sarah couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. His words had left an indelible mark, forcing her to confront feelings she had long tried to bury. As she moved through her daily routines, she began to notice the cracks in her own life more clearly, details she had previously ignored or justified. Mark, her husband, had always been a provider, but lately, his absence felt heavier than his presence. His late nights at work stretched into weekends, and when he was home, the silence between them was deafening. Sarah told herself it was the nature of marriage, that every couple experienced these lulls. But deep down, she wondered if their relationship had turned into something more hollow than she wanted to admit. Her thoughts often returned to Ethan. The worry etched on his face haunted her, and she couldn't help but feel as though she had let him down. His sudden awareness of her unhappiness made her question how much she had failed to hide. Had her quiet sighs, her distracted glances, and her growing detachment been that obvious? If Ethan had noticed, how much longer before Mark did? As the days passed, Ethan's behavior began to shift as well. The carefree boy who used to fill the house with laughter seemed distant, burdened by something he couldn't express. Sarah caught him watching her, his eyes searching for answers she wasn't ready to give. He would linger in the kitchen after dinner or pause at her door before retreating to his room. Every interaction left Sarah with the sinking feeling that she was losing him, too. One evening, as she cleared the dishes from dinner, she caught a glimpse of Ethan pacing outside on the porch. His restless movements mirrored the turmoil she felt inside. She wanted to comfort him, to assure him that everything would be okay. But the truth was, she didn't know if it would be. The uncertainty of her own life left her unable to offer him the reassurance he needed. Meanwhile, Mark continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He would kiss Sarah on the cheek as he left for work, the gesture so automatic it felt devoid of meaning. Their conversations were brief, focused on logistics rather than feelings. It wasn't that Mark was unkind. He was the same man she had married. But that was the problem. She had changed, and he hadn't noticed. Late one night, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Mark snored softly beside her. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't quiet. The question Ethan had asked her echoed in her head. Have you thought about what makes you happy? The truth was, she hadn't. She had spent so much time focusing on others, on being a good wife and mother, that she had lost sight of herself. The following day, as she folded laundry in the living room, Ethan approached her. His expression was serious, his voice quiet. Mom, I know something's wrong. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, but I'm here. Just don't shut me out. His words hit her harder than she expected. Sarah realized she was not only failing herself, but the people who cared most about her. The walls she had built to protect her emotions were isolating her instead. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her, forcing her to question everything she had once taken for granted. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself in a strange, uncharted territory. Her once familiar routines now felt foreign, and the relationships she had depended on seemed to shift in ways she couldn't fully understand. The tension between her and Mark persisted, but it was Ethan's quiet presence that began to take up more and more space in her thoughts. Ethan had always been perceptive, but now his attentiveness bordered on uncanny. He noticed when Sarah seemed lost in thought and would pause to check on her. A simple, "Are you okay, Mom?" would stop her in her tracks. His tone was soft, filled with concern that made her chest ache with guilt. She knew he was trying to help, to connect with her, but it only highlighted how distant she felt from everyone else in her life. One evening, after Mark had gone to bed early, exhausted from another long day at work, Sarah found herself alone in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine. The house was silent, save for the faint creaks of the old wooden floors. She heard Ethan's footsteps before she saw him. He stepped into the dimly lit kitchen, his expression uncertain but warm. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, attempting a smile. He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Not really. You?" Sarah sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. "No. Just thinking, I guess." Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've been doing a lot of that lately." The comment was casual, but it struck a nerve. She looked at him, searching for a response, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she motioned for him to sit. He pulled out a chair at the table, his presence both comforting and unsettling. For a while, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Then Ethan broke it. "Mom, you don't have to pretend with me. I know things aren't okay." Sarah looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes, so much like her own, were filled with an intensity she hadn't noticed before. She wanted to deny it, to brush off his concern, but she couldn't. Instead, she nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "I don't know how to explain it, Ethan," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm losing myself, like I'm trapped in a life I don't recognize anymore." Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The gesture was innocent, but the warmth of his touch sent a jolt through her. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. Ethan seemed to notice her discomfort and looked away, his own face tinged with uncertainty. "Mom," he began, his voice soft. "I just want you to be happy. Whatever that means, whatever you need to do, I'll support you." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened her confusion. How could she explain the storm of emotions swirling inside her? The longing for something more, something she couldn't name, was overwhelming. And now, sitting across from her son, she felt a connection that frightened her. It wasn't wrong, at least, not in the way it might seem, but it was intense, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself avoiding Ethan, afraid of the feelings his presence stirred in her. But avoiding him only seemed to draw him closer. He would knock on her door, offering a quiet word of encouragement or a warm smile. Each time her heart raced, torn between gratitude and fear. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Ethan shifted closer to her on the couch. His arm brushed against hers, and she tensed, her breath catching. He noticed and pulled back slightly, his expression apologetic. "Sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "It's okay," she replied quickly, her voice higher than she intended. "I'm just tired." The truth was, she wasn't just tired. She was terrified. Terrified of the emotions she couldn't name, the boundaries she was desperate not to cross. Yet, she couldn't deny the comfort she felt in Ethan's presence, the way his concern seemed to fill the void that had grown inside her. As the movie ended and Ethan stood to leave, he paused, looking back at her. "Good night, Mom. I'm here if you need anything." "Good night, sweetheart," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When the door closed behind him, Sarah sat in the darkness, her thoughts racing. She knew she needed to address the growing tension in her life, the choices she had been avoiding. But where to start? With Mark? With Ethan? Or with herself? The lines between her roles as wife, mother, and individual were blurring, and she felt herself slipping further into a place she couldn't escape. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Something had to change, and soon. The air in the house felt heavier as Sarah's internal struggle began to affect every aspect of her life. Conversations with Mark became shorter, their connections strained to the point where even pleasantries felt like an effort. Ethan, on the other hand, remained attentive, always hovering nearby with a quiet presence that both comforted and unsettled her. One evening, after another hollow dinner with Mark, Sarah retreated to her bedroom. The shadows of her past decisions and the confusion of her present life loomed large, but she still couldn't find the courage to face the truth. She sank onto the bed, her head in her hands, when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice barely audible. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "Mom, can we talk?" Sarah nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He crossed the room and perched on the edge of the bed, his movements deliberate and careful. "What's on your mind?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I should be asking you that," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Mom, I can't just sit back and watch you pretend everything's fine when it's not." The vulnerability in his words cut through her defenses. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but the weight of her own uncertainty held her back. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered. "I've been trying so hard to keep things together, but I don't know how anymore." Ethan's hand reached out, brushing hers lightly. "You don't have to do it alone, Mom. I'm here." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside her. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into his comfort, to let the weight of her emotions spill over. But as she did, the boundaries of their relationship felt blurred, the lines between maternal care and emotional dependence dangerously thin. She pulled away abruptly, her heart pounding. "Ethan, I can't do this. It's not fair to you." He looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. What do you mean? Before she could respond, the door opened, and Mark stepped into the room. His eyes darted between them, his expression unreadable. Am I interrupting something? Sarah froze, her mind racing. No, we were just talking, she said quickly, her voice strained. Mark's gaze lingered on them for a moment before he nodded. All right. Ethan, it's late. You should head to bed. Ethan hesitated, his eyes searching Sarah's, but he nodded and left the room. The tension in the air was suffocating as Mark closed the door behind him and turned to face Sarah. What's going on, Sarah? He asked, his tone firm but not accusatory. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. I feel like I'm falling apart, like I'm losing myself. Mark sat down beside her, his expression softening. We've been married for a long time, Sarah. I know when something's wrong, but I can't help you if you don't let me in. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the confusion and loneliness that had consumed her. But the words felt too heavy, too dangerous. It's not just us, Mark, she said finally. It's me. I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I've been pretending for so long that I don't even know what's real. Mark reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Then let's figure it out together. Whatever it takes, Sarah. I'm not giving up on us. His words brought a flicker of hope, but they also reminded her of the enormity of the choices she faced. Could she find herself within the life she had built? Or would she have to leave it behind to rediscover who she truly was? The days that followed were fraught with tension as Sarah tried to navigate her emotions. She began spending more time alone, walking through the neighborhood or sitting in the park, searching for clarity. Ethan noticed her absence and tried to reach out, but she kept her distance, afraid of deepening the confusion between them. One evening, as she stood on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan approached her. Mom, I feel like you're avoiding me, he said, his voice tinged with hurt. Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, Ethan. I need some space to figure things out. He nodded, though his expression showed he didn't fully understand. I just want you to be happy. His words lingered in her mind long after he walked away. They echoed in her thoughts as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Happiness. It seemed like such a simple concept, yet it felt so unattainable. The breaking point came the following morning when Mark confronted her in the kitchen. Sarah, we can't keep doing this, he said, his voice firm. I can see you slipping away, and I don't know how to stop it. But I need to know if you even want to try. His words forced her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know, Mark. I don't know what I want anymore. The honesty in her voice seemed to shake him. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her admission. Then we need to figure it out, Sarah. Because this, whatever this is, it's not working. The conversation left Sarah reeling, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time, she had admitted the depth of her confusion, not just to herself, but to Mark. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Later that day, as she sat alone in the park, Sarah realized that her journey wasn't about choosing between Mark and something, or someone, else. It was about finding herself, rediscovering the woman she had been before life's demands and expectations had buried her. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she needed to start somewhere. The days after Sarah's confrontation with Mark felt like walking through the ruins of a life she no longer recognized. The unspoken tension in the house was palpable, stretching thin between her, Mark, and Ethan. Each conversation felt like treading on eggshells, careful not to crack open the fragile calm they all clung to. Mark tried to keep things functional, but the spark of hope he once carried seemed to dim with every passing day. He stayed later at work, came home quieter, and spent more time alone in his office. Sarah knew he was giving her the space she claimed she needed, but the distance between them only grew wider. Ethan, on the other hand, wasn't as willing to let things settle into silence. He often sought Sarah out, whether to share a quiet meal or simply sit with her in the living room. His presence was both comforting and unsettling, a constant reminder of the emotional weight she carried. His concern for her was genuine, but it only highlighted how much her struggles had impacted him. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan broke the silence. "Mom, I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him, her chest tightening. "You're not going to lose me, Ethan," she replied, though her own uncertainty made the words feel hollow. "You say that," he said, his tone more assertive now. "But it feels like you're slipping away. From me, from Dad, from everything." His words stung, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm trying, Ethan. I'm trying to figure out what's best for everyone." "What about what's best for you?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "You've spent so much time worrying about everyone else that you've forgotten about yourself." Sarah couldn't respond. He was right, of course, but acknowledging it felt selfish. The guilt of wanting more, of needing more, was a weight she couldn't seem to shake. The breaking point came one night when Mark returned home earlier than usual. He found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand and a distant look in her eyes. Without a word, he sat across from her, his expression serious but calm. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said firmly. She nodded, bracing herself for whatever was to come. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Mark began, "and I realize I haven't been the husband you needed. I've been so focused on work and providing for us that I forgot to be here for you." Sarah's breath caught. It was the first time he had acknowledged the growing distance between them. "But," he continued, his voice steady, "I can't fix this on my own. I need to know if you still want this. Us. Because if you don't, I need to know now." His words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Sarah felt the full weight of the choices before her. She looked at Mark, seeing not just her husband, but a man who had tried, in his own way, to make their life together work. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet resignation that came from years of being overlooked. "I don't know if I can give you the answer you're looking for," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Mark. I need time to figure that out." Mark's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. "Then take the time you need. But I can't promise I'll be here waiting forever." His honesty was both devastating and liberating. It gave her the freedom to focus on herself, but it also made her realize just how much she stood to lose. As Mark left the room, Sarah felt the sting of tears in her eyes. She wasn't sure if this was the end of their marriage or the beginning of something new, but she knew things could never go back to the way they were. Meanwhile, her relationship with Ethan became a source of both solace and discomfort. He continued to be her confidant, offering a level of support that felt almost too mature for his age. But Sarah couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in their dynamic, the way his concerns sometimes crossed into something deeper. She hated herself for noticing it, for wondering if her own vulnerability had blurred the lines between them. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Ethan reached for her hand. "Whatever happens, Mom, I'm here for you. Always." His words were meant to reassure, but they sent a chill down her spine. She gently pulled her hand away, forcing a smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot." But as she lay awake that night, Sarah realized she couldn't keep leaning on Ethan the way she had been. It wasn't fair to him, or to herself. She needed to find her own strength, to face the truth of her life and the choices that lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began to take small steps toward clarity. She started seeing a therapist, someone who could help her untangle the web of emotions and decisions that had trapped her. She spent more time alone, journaling and reflecting on what she truly wanted. And though the road ahead seemed daunting, she felt a glimmer of hope that she hadn't felt in years. Mark and Ethan both noticed the change. Mark gave her space, but his quiet support remained. Ethan, though still attentive, seemed to sense her need for boundaries. Slowly, the tension in the house began to ease, though the future was still uncertain. Sarah didn't know where this journey would take her, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living for others at the expense of herself. It was time to reclaim her life, no matter how difficult or painful the process might be. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of a quiet transformation for Sarah. The tangled web of emotions and confusion that had held her captive for so long began to loosen, thread by thread. She was far from having all the answers, but she was finally asking the right questions. Not about what others needed from her, but about what she needed for herself. Her therapy sessions became a lifeline, a space where she could speak without fear of judgment. Through them, Sarah started to understand that her unhappiness wasn't solely about her marriage or her role as a mother. It was about the pieces of herself she had lost over the years, the dreams she had abandoned, the passions she had buried. She began to see that reclaiming those pieces wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Mark noticed the change in her, and though their relationship remained fragile, he seemed to respect her efforts. One evening, as they sat on the porch in the fading light, he broke the silence. "You seem lighter," he said, his voice tentative. Sarah nodded, offering a small smile. "I think I'm starting to figure things out." Mark looked at her, his expression a mixture of hope and caution. "Does that include us?" Her smile faltered, and she took a deep breath. "I don't know yet, Mark, but I want to be honest with you, with myself, about where I'm at. And right now, I'm still figuring that out." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I can live with that, for now." Their conversation wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward. For the first time in years, Sarah felt that they were on the same page, even if they didn't know where the story would end. Meanwhile, her relationship with Ethan also began to shift. She set clear boundaries, ensuring that their connection remained rooted in love and respect without veering into territory that made her uncomfortable. Ethan seemed to understand, and his attentiveness became less intense, more balanced. They started to rebuild their bond as mother and son, finding comfort in the simplicity of shared moments, cooking dinner together, laughing over old family stories, or simply sitting in companionable silence. Sarah's journey wasn't without its challenges. There were days when the weight of uncertainty felt unbearable, when the pull of old habits and roles threatened to drag her back into the life she was trying to leave behind. But each time, she reminded herself that growth was a process, not a destination. She didn't need to have all the answers right away. She just needed to keep moving forward. In time, Sarah began to rediscover herself. She picked up old hobbies she had long abandoned: painting, gardening, writing in her journal. These small acts of self-expression became her sanctuary, a way to reconnect with the woman she had once been and the woman she was becoming. Through it all, Sarah came to a powerful realization. Her worth wasn't tied to her roles as a wife or a mother. She was more than the sum of her relationships, more than the expectations others placed on her. She was her own person, deserving of happiness and fulfillment in her own right. By the end of her journey, Sarah wasn't the same woman she had been at the beginning of the story. She was stronger, more self-aware, and more at peace with herself. Her marriage with Mark was still a work in progress, and there was no guarantee of its future. But for the first time, She felt that their relationship had a foundation of honesty rather than pretense. Ethan, too, seemed to grow from the experience. Their bond, though tested, emerged stronger, built on mutual respect and understanding. Sarah was grateful for his love and support, but was careful not to lean on him in ways that blurred the lines of their relationship. As Sarah sat alone one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. She still didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was on the right path. Her journey had taught her a profound lesson. Life was messy, complicated, and often painful. But it was also beautiful, filled with opportunities for growth and change. And no matter how far she had strayed from herself, it was never too late to come home. If you were in Sarah's position, how would you handle such a tangled web of emotions and relationships? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, it's never too late to rediscover yourself and fight for the life you deserve. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon for more stories that explore life's deepest complexities. Stay tuned. You won't believe what's coming next.